Okay, welcome everybody to the final code seminar of this academic year. Today we're very lucky to have with us Dr. Roaa Ali, who's lecturer in creative and cultural industries and the director of the Creative and Cultural Industries Programme at the University of Manchester, with expertise in race and diversity within the cultural sector. Her research focuses on inequality, anti-racism, and the politics of cultural production in the creative industries. Dr. Ali has published extensively on these topics in leading international journals and contributed theoretical frameworks that drive industry and policy discourse. The research on Arab American identity and cultural production post 9/11 is the subject of her forthcoming monograph, The Cultural Production of Otherness, Contemporary Arab American Drama, which this seminar is based on. Her other edited volume on Arabs, Politics and Performance was published last year. She currently sits on the advisory board for the Polycultural Institute in Chicago, is a member of the Arts and Humanities Research Council's Peer Review College, and is a recipient of the Wallace Foundation Research Grant. So without any further ado, Roaa.
Thank you for being here this very warm June afternoon. And this talk, is part of my forthcoming book, The Cultural Production of Otherness. So please buy a copy when it's out, and I will remind you of that by email. And I want to speak today from a position. I want to speak from a position that is at once scholarly and personal. So this seminar is based on my research into Arab Americans' cultural production, and more specifically into what I term pragmatist feminism. It is a framework that emerges not from theory alone, but from the lived experience, creative strategies and tactical negotiations of Arab American women playwrights who work within a post 9/11 American cultural landscape that is both inviting and censoring, empowering and constraining. As a scholar of Arab descent myself, I find that my positionality is deeply entangled in this project. How do I evaluate Arab American women's feminism and activism in a neoliberal and neo-Orientalist environment when similar sets of circumstances define my own Arab immigrant feminism and activism here in the UK? The genesis of this inquiry began with my immersion in the rich, complex world of Arab American drama. What immediately stood out was the genre's political intensity, its boldness in confronting themes of race, empire, gender, and surveillance. This sensibility, however, seemed to clash with the prevailing trends within the American theatrical mainstream, where the emphasis overwhelmingly falls on apolitical narratives of personal and family dynamics. And what intrigued me further was a discernible pattern. As I delved deeper into the field, I noticed that Arab American women playwrights were not only being staged, but often positioned at the forefront of cultural conversations when it came to Arab American productions. Some of their works received critical acclaim, festival invitations, and major institutional support. Opportunity is far less accessible to their male counterparts. The why of this asymmetry became a compelling question for me as the intersection of race, gender, and Orientalism appeared to signal not simply a moment of inclusion, but a strategic form of cultural gatekeeping. What began as a question about representational imbalance quickly evolved into something more layered. I found myself drawn into a deeper examination of the intersecting forces at play: solidarity movements, feminist expression, aesthetic experimentation, institutional politics, and the strategic demands placed on artists operating from racialized and gendered subject positions. And so in this talk, I explore what I describe as pragmatist feminism, a form of feminist cultural production shaped by constraint, but not defeated by it. This talk that follows charts how Arab American women artists navigate and often strategically engage the limits imposed on their visibility. So I ask, what kind of feminism is made possible when inclusion is conditional? How do these artists craft space for themselves and others in a cultural field shaped by neoliberal benevolence and Orientalist expectations? And crucially, what do their creative choices teach us about the evolving nature of feminist resistance in racialized cultural production? It is also a feminist excavation into the ways Arab American women use the stage in all its constraints and possibilities as a space for survival, visibility, and resistance. So the project really is not merely about documenting representation, but interrogating the conditions of its production and reception. So what is pragmatist feminism? The concept of pragmatist feminism emerges from a need to account for the paradoxes and contradictions that Arab American women face when producing art and culture in the US context. It is a feminism marked not by abstract universals and humanism or loud radicalism, but by strategic navigation within structurally constrained environments. It takes seriously the idea that feminist resistance can take many forms, including subtlety, ambiguity, and compromises. While pragmatist feminism has roots in feminist philosophy, particularly within the American pragmatism, Siegfried book on pragmatism and feminism, and Shannon Sullivan book, which is Living Across and Through Skins, I mobilized the concept in a new context. To understand the strategic negotiations that Arab American women artists make within a racialized cultural economy. Here, pragmatist feminism is not just a philosophical orientation, but a practice navigating visibility, representation, and constraint. Pragmatist feminism describes a mode of artistic and political practice in which Arab American women negotiate the contradictory demands of being visible but not threatening, authentic but not oppositional, expressive but not radical. These negotiations are not failures of feminist politics, but illustration of its contextual intelligence. This feminism is forged in racialized conditions of precarity, surveillance, and market calculations. It reflects the complexities of producing racialized, gendered, and politically marked narratives within institutions that reward conformity but demand diversity. And Arab American women playwrights challenge both internal patriarchal narratives or structures, and external Orientalist expectations. They do so through a feminism that is adaptive, context-aware, and tactically expressive. And they navigate what I call a neoliberal, neo-Orientalist cultural apparatus, which is a framework in which Arab American women are included precisely because they are seen as redeemable, docile, or safe subjects. This is not a space of empowerment in any unqualified sense. It's one in which Arab American women perform empowerment in ways that are legible to funders, critics, and audiences, often unfamiliar with the deeper histories of empire and resistance that shape our Arab culture life. To quote Nada Elia, and I begin the quote, "The privileging of Muslim and Arab American women over their male compatriots is apparent in numerous forms, revealing a pattern of viewing the woman as harmless and redeemable, the men as perennial enemies, never to be trusted," end of quote. This gendered racial logic opens a space of visibility for Arab American women, but it also dictates the terms of that visibility. Pragmatist feminism, then, is born in the cracks between empowerment and erasure. And it requires a recognition that visibility is never neutral, but always structured by the gaze of the power. And so I want to talk, apologies, I should have put that a bit earlier. But I want to talk now about the environment of post 9/11 and about the gendered visibility post 9/11. So the aftermath of 9/11 attacks marked a seismic shift in American cultural and political life. For Arab Americans, this shift was characterized by suspicion, surveillance, and a racialization that fused religion, geography, and ethnicity into one suspicious category. And I quote that category: Middle Eastern, Arab, or Muslim. But as Louise Carniker shows, this category was not experienced equally by all. Arab and Muslim men were constructed as security threats, while women were positioned as cultural threats, figures in need of assimilation, reform, or rescue. This bifurcation is deeply embedded in the history of Orientalism. As Edward Said argued, the East has long been represented in the West as a site of sensuality, backwardness, and irrationality, a foil against which the West constructs its own modernity. Arab and Muslim women in particular have been positioned as symbolic of their culture's otherness, often portrayed as passive victims of patriarchy, waiting to be liberated by the enlightened West. As Spivak famously puts it, and I quote, "This is the logic of," and I quote, "white men saving brown women from brown men," and I end of quote. This trope was revived with new vigor in the post 9/11 period. Both President Bush and First Lady Laura Bush cited the liberation of Afghan women as justification for war, cloaking military intervention in feminist rhetoric. Litty Volb notes in her article how the hijab became a site of national anxiety and a symbol of otherness, casting veiled Muslim women as visible emblems of an unassimilated, even hostile cultural identity. Arab American women were thus placed in a double bind. They were expected to be both authentic, representative of their cultures, and reassuring affirmations of its transformation. Artistic platforms, including theatre, increasingly welcomed their voices, but only insofar as they adhered to certain expectations. These women were offered spaces to reclaim their voice, but that reclamation was filtered through the logic of white liberal benevolence. So that voice is available courtesy to white institutions that enabled those spaces. As Amal Amira and Lisa Majaj observe, the inclusion of Arab women in Western institutions was never neutral. It operated within, and I quote, discursive, institutional, and ideological structures, end of quote, that regulated what could be said and how. The post 9/11 context merely intensified this regulation, turning Arab American women into curated spokespersons for a digestible diversity. They were invited into the cultural mainstream, but only if they could reassure rather than unsettle. And these Arab American women often found themselves as well balancing the imperative to challenge patriarchal norms and scrutinizing gender ethics within their own communities and the Arab societies, but doing so risks reinforcing Orientalist stereotypes that depict Arab culture as backwards or in need of Western rescue. Silence, however, allows others to control the narrative. As Layla Buck, who is an Arab American playwright, puts it, Arab American artists walk, and I quote, a double-edged sword, end of quote, caught between community expectations of positive portrayals and the danger of confirming outside prejudices. And so, what is the intervention of theatre or these Arab American women in theatre? In the American theatrical institution, these dynamics were especially pronounced. The cancellation of a play called My Name's Rachel Corey in 2006 at the New York Theatre Workshop exposed the limits of liberal multicultural inclusion. Corey's words, drawn from her diaries, Rachel Corey was an American white activist who was killed by by the Israeli bulldozers as she was trying to protect a Palestinian home from being demolished. So Corey's words, drawn from her diaries, documenting her solidarity with Palestinians, proved too incendiary for the American stage. The play was cancelled amid fears of offending donors and audiences, and the outrage that followed was less about Corey than about what the theatre system could and could not tolerate. The red line, it turned out, was Palestine. In the aftermath, a New York Theatre Workshop sought to recover its liberal credentials by partnering with Arab American artists. This included inviting the Arab American Women's Theatre Collective, Nebras, to become a company in residence, and commissioning the showcase Aswat, Voices from Palestine, in 2007. However, from the many works presented, only those by women, notably Arab American women playwrights Betty Shamieh, Layla Buck, and Lamis Ishaq, were developed further, although analyzing the works of these selected artists show what I think is a depoliticized representation of Palestine. The message was clear. Arab women were welcome, but only if their work did not overtly critique Israel or American foreign policy. Here again, we see the workings of what I call pragmatist feminism. The selected playwrights made complex dramaturgical choices to ensure their work could be staged. For instance, the play Food and Fedwa by Ishaq and Kader tells the story of Palestinian women preparing for a family wedding in Bethlehem. The occupation is never denied. It is represented through curfews, power cuts, and observed checkpoint scenes, but they remain in the background. One memorable scene features a character mapping Palestinian geography through a plate of hummus. Amir, so I quote just an expert from the play. A character, Amir, says, now Bethlehem is here in area A, in the hummus. If you want to get from hummus to hummus, you don't need a fork, you can just use bread. Hayat, another character, what does the bread represent? Amir, nothing, it's just the best way to eat hummus. The scene borders on the absurd in here. It gestures toward the fragmentation of Palestinian land, but refrains from dramatizing the violence that enforces it. Ishaq later explained the strategy in an interview, and I quote, so the playwright, and I quote the playwright. We tried to let the aspects of the occupation be in the periphery, yet still deeply integrated into the family's daily life, so it felt organic to the story. End of quote. This is pragmatist feminism at work. The occupation is not erased, but carefully staged in a way that secures visibility without triggering censorship. It is a strategy of narrative moderation that ensures the story can be told without being suppressed. It is a form of feminist survival that, while imperfect, allows for voice, complexity, and representation in a hostile cultural field. Such strategies are not unique to Ishaq. They reflect a broader pattern among Arab American women artists who must constantly weigh the costs of truth-telling against the rewards of legibility. These artists are not surrendering to censorship, they are navigating it with acuity. Their feminist intervention lies in the very act of storytelling under constraint, a refusal to be silenced, even if that voice must sometimes speak in code. And the politics of representations in Arab American women's theatre does not end with the script. It extends into what Genete calls the paratext. The paratext is the threshold. So the paratext is defined as the threshold through which a text is received and interpreted. The published version of Heather Raffo, another Arab American playwright, very successful, and this play is one of the most successful Arab American plays. The published version of Heather Raffo's 9 Parts of Desire offers a compelling example. The English title appears prominently in bold, gold letters, while the Arabic title, I don't know if you can see it at all.
It's here. It's shadowing the. It starts from right to left.
Yeah, it's shadowing, but it's very, yeah. Basically, this is it. I think that kind of explains where it's there, but please hide me or keep me in the shadow. So while the English title appears prominently in bold gold letters, the Arabic title, "Tis'at Ajza' min al-Raghbah," is shadowed underneath and hardly visible. It reflects a broader tension in Arab American cultural production. Arabness is included but must be subdued, present but peripheral. Jeanette describes the paratext as a space of negotiation, and I quote, "a threshold of interpretation," end of quote, that conditions the reception of the work. Raffo's ghosted Arabic functions symbolically, standing in for the conditional inclusion of Arab identity in the post-9/11 US theatrical field. It visually enacts the permissibility of Arab American women's stories, but only when translated, softened, or ghosted to fit dominant frameworks. This symbolic marginalization continues into the text of 9 Parts of Desire itself. Raffo's play presents 9 Iraqi women navigating love, loss, war, and resistance. It's a powerful portrayal of women's endurance, and yet it avoids direct confrontation with US imperial violence. The character Huda, who is an expatriate academic, says, and I quote, this is from the play, "The mistake is not the war. No, America had to do it. The mistake was supporting Saddam all his life," end of quote. This moment exemplifies the strategic ambiguity in Raffo's dramaturgy. While the suffering under Saddam is depicted in vivid, often horrific details, the American occupation is only lightly sketched. I think I've got, not yet, no. So whereas Saddam's violence is vividly dramatized, the American occupation is only lightly sketched and often using silences and eclipses. For example, the character, the American, describes Abu Ghraib in sparse staccato lines, and I quote from the. I should have put this, I'm sorry, in the room. So this is describing Abu Ghraib. Still, and we are smiling at, and this is like so there is like a pause between each. Still, we are smiling at a man naked with a sandbag on his head, raped with a chemical light. But that's the only violence we see compared to the violence that I'm gonna narrate now. These lines, while haunting, contrast sharply with Huda's extensive monologue detailing sexual torture under Saddam's regime. This is Huda describing Saddam's violence. They brought her baby, 3-month-old baby, outside the cell. They put this woman's baby in a bag with starving cats. They recorded the sound of this and her rape, and they played it for her husband in his cell. The asymmetry invites scrutiny. In this, an aesthetic choice or a reflection of the politics of cultural production. In either case, the effect is one, I think, of depoliticization when it comes to the American foreign policy. Maria Beach argues that Rafo's play presents, and I quote, multiplicity of political point of views, but ultimately centers the suffering of Iraqi women, not the system of violence that creates it. End of quote. The emotional humanism, while valuable, can also serve to neutralize critique. Rafo herself remarked that liberal audiences were sometimes, and I quote, confused, end of quote, when the play did not validate anti-war sentiments, while conservatives were, and I quote, thrown, end of quote, by how deeply they connected with the humanity of the characters. This reception history confirms how 9 Parts of Desire fits within a representational frame that rewards affective empathy over political analysis. Yet this is where pragmatist feminist strategy becomes clear. Rafo creates a space for Iraqi women's voices on the American stage by narrating suffering in ways that resonate with existing liberal humanitarian discourses. She avoids overt political alignments, perhaps knowing that to speak too critically of American violence could jeopardize the play's production and reception. The result is not apolitical theatre, but politics in moderation. But at the same time, she refuses to represent those women in the purely Orientalist expectations. In her production notes for this play, she writes, and I quote, "I would encourage those doing a production to never think of these women as victims or portray them sentimentally, but rather to explore the resilience, ambitions, warmth, humor, integrity, and ancient history of the Iraqi women depicted here," end of quote. And in here, Rafo also reclaims feminist subjectivity from both the West's saving gaze and the East's patriarchal silence. The dual negotiation is the hallmark of pragmatist feminism. And Betty Charmier is another playwright, Arab-American playwright, and she offers a compelling case of pragmatist feminism in action. She is a Palestinian-American playwright within an Ivy League pedigree. Charmier has long spoken about the difficulty of writing Arab identity in an American theatrical field that is eager to pigeonhole her. Early in her career, she avoided Arab characters altogether, wary of being typecast, as she recalls, and I quote, "I kept plays dealing with Arab characters and culture private until I felt safe, which is hard to feel when you are in your early 20s anyway, particularly if you are a minority trying to break into a field where few or no members of your race are working," end of quote. Her 2004 off-Broadway debut, Roar, that's the title of her play, dramatizes a generational conflict within a Palestinian immigrant family. The daughter, Irene, dreams of becoming a blues singer. Her parents grapple with their memories of Palestine and the trauma of exile. While the play centers Arab American characters, it largely avoids the politics of occupation or diaspora. The conflict is staged in domestic interpersonal terms. As Yasser Salim observes, the Palestinian-Israeli conflict is, and I quote, marginal, end of quote, often evaded or truncated. This dramaturgical choice is part of a broader strategy. Shamia has consistently argued that theatre's political power lies not in delivering ideological messages, but in humanizing the other. I don't agree. In a blog post reflecting on her career, she writes, and I quote, "What would it mean if there were more stories that sensitized audiences to the fact that there is an indefinable yet recognizable human essence that unites us? It is theatre's ability to humanize that makes it so politically potent." End of quote. And this kind of depoliticization goes into her plays. There's another example from her play, The Black-Eyed, which is fantastic, but again, it works with the Palestinian subject in very careful manner and in a non-confrontational manner. The play, there was a dialogue in that play, and earlier versions of that play, which was censored. It wasn't allowed to be produced. So she rewrote that scene. It was censored again, and it wasn't staged. And she rewrote it again, and it became a monologue in a bigger play called The Black-Eyed. But the politics of it was very thinned and trimmed. But the success, and then she has won a mainstream acceptance. And in her acceptance to the American Task Force on Palestine Award, Shamia declared, and I quote, "I was told all my life by Palestinians and others that I would never make it in American theatre if I wrote about Palestinian issues. Whatever small success I have achieved has been in spite of the constant messages of defeatism that are rife within our community," end of quote. However, the success she refers to is deeply conditional, contingent on how far political content can be muted, how well Arabness can be rendered palatable. Yet even within these conditions, Shamia has staged complex Palestinian women who defy stereotype. You can't read them easy. Her feminism, like Rafo's feminism, operates within containment, but it does not capitulate. It pushes at the boundaries even as it acknowledges them. I don't know how my slides very well. There is a very good, a brilliant article, actually, 1988, by Denise Candioti, which is about bargaining with patriarchy. And I borrow this patriarchal bargaining, and I use it in the context of Arab American women and how they navigate the space. And how, so they are navigating patriarchal system not only by resisting them, but by strategically accommodating them to maximize agency. And in parallel vein, Arab American women playwrights operate under a regime of racialized gatekeeping. And in this case, it's not patriarchy, but liberal multiculturalism. Specifically, its demand for balanced, non-threatening narratives that sets the terms of participation. The case of food and fadwa, where the hummus quote comes from, exemplifies this feminist bargain. The play centers Palestinian family, but chooses to displace their political conflict to the background, making food, wedding preparations, and familial tensions the main drivers of the plot, often a common strategy. The domestic. And what we see here is not a retreat from politics, but a careful choreography of representation. A theatre critic, Harstrom, reviewing the play Food and Fadwa, noted that it resembled, and I quote, a sitcom with a tragic twist, end of quote, and suggested that the occupation is, quote, less a harsh reality than a giant elephant in the room, made more obvious by the collective refusal to acknowledge its presence, end of quote. And this raises the critical question, is this erasure or resistance? Is silence here a symptom of institutional pressure or a tactic to subvert the pressure from within? My argument is that the answer lies in reading these silences not as absences, but as acts of calculated presence. The playwrights are not simply omitting, they are negotiating. And these negotiations are not without cost, but they are also not without agency. The pragmatist feminist strategy does not celebrate compromise, but it does illuminate how compromise becomes a site of subversive creativity. And so in here, this is where I think I'm thinking about intervention. And probably this is also a reflection of my own thinking, pragmatism and radicalism. And when reading these works within those conditions of cultural production, I see them not through the binary of radical versus compromise, but through the lens of feminist negotiation. In doing so, I seek to complicate how we understand artistic resistance under neoliberalism. It is not always loud, it's often quiet, tactical, and deeply embedded in institutional critique. And I want to just point out briefly to two things here, which are further techniques or strategies that these playwrights are using. And these in confronting Orientalist representations of Arab women. So in all of the plays that I've analyzed, these women are very empowered, despite all of the circumstances they live in, despite their sufferings. They are sexual agents. They have agency over their actions and over their sexualities and their bodies and over their choices, even if those choices were constructed by patriarchy. And within that, I say that there is kind of a resistance and an oppositional framework to Orientalism and Orientalist representation. And there is also, they use collectivity as well. So instead of having one kind of character being the protagonist, they use a chorus of voices. Usually the chorus, those chorus of women come in very difficult moments in the play. And they used as a dramaturgical device into showing those voices. And I've got really some beautiful quotes about feminist collectivity, both in the Black Light and on Parts of Desire, but particularly in 9 Parts of Desire, which is about Iraq and the Iraqi women. So all the Iraqi women, the 9 Iraqi women voices kind of come out in the end in the voice of this one woman who leads a call to response. And she says, I have too much existence. I have lived through 7,000 revolutions, which also the voice of Iraq and the history of Iraq Iraqi womanhood. Either I shall die or I shall live a ransom for all the daughters of savagery. End of quote. And kind of in her voices, it's when the women on stage can't actually tell their stories because they've been too burdened by their own experiences. This collective voice comes out to kind of help them finish their stories. And I say, this is not just mere poetry, it's a feminist praxis. It's the articulation of a politics that understands national memory through women memory, and resistance as polyvocal, contradictory and embodied. So I also want just to kind of think about how these Arab American women not only responding, but actively reconfiguring the frameworks that attempt to contain them. If pragmatist feminism operates within constraints, it also presses against its edges, transforming the boundaries of cultural possibility. And so the frame here refers to both the discursive structures that govern Arab American visibility and the material institutions, so funders, theatres, critics, that judge whose stories are heard. And for Arab American women, they challenge this frame by insisting on their artistic agency, or at least navigating it, or keeping it present, and using ways to keep it present. Take Shamier's, so Betty Shamier's The Black-Eyed play, which was partially born out of institutional censorship. Her original script of for a festival in New York was rejected for being too political. Instead of withdrawing, she rewrote the piece into a story of an Arab American woman aboard a hijacked plane, one that would ultimately be edited again without her consent. But Shamier didn't discard the material. She incorporated and reframed it into The Black-Eyed, transforming censorship into content. She later reflected, and I quote, "So, in an Uncle Tom-like manner, instead of holding my ground, I wrote another piece. Arab American artists are largely faceless in this country, and I felt that by dropping out, I would be helping those who are trying to keep it that way." And the act is emblematic of pragmatist feminism's refusal to disappear. Shamier chooses visibility, not because the space is perfect, but because occupying it matters. By doing so, she exposes the mechanism that police Arab American voice while asserting her own narrative authority. So let me try to conclude. So in concluding the seminar, I return to the central provocation of the talk. What happens when feminist voice is granted on conditional terms? What forms of resistance, negotiation, and creativity arise when Arab American women are visible only if they remain legible to white liberal benevolence? Pragmatist feminism, as I'm trying to outline, is not a resignation to constraint. It is a mode of feminist authorship that works through constraint, laying bare the conditional nature of inclusion while insisting on the right to speak. It recognizes that representation is never neutral, that it's always structured by power, and yet it refuses to concede artistic ground. Arab American women playwrights like Betty Shamier, Heather Raffo, Lanis Ishaq, and Layla Buck do not merely appear on the American stage, they reshape it. They introduce complex Arab women characters who are not simply victims or heroines, but agents of their own ambiguous layered narratives. They challenge audiences to confront their assumptions, not only about Arab and Muslims, but about what constitutes legitimate political art. Their work resists what Sarah Ahmed calls, and I quote, the happiness duty, end of quote. The imperative for minoritized voices to be grateful, non-confrontational, and pleasing. These playwrights do not aim to make their audiences comfortable. Rather, they make visible the emotional, political, and cultural labor required to speak at all. Their art is discomforting, demanding, and deeply necessary. And so in a time when the visibility of Arab voices is increasingly weaponized or silenced, the pragmatic, deliberate, and creative feminist interventions of these artists matter. They remind us that visibility is not the end of struggle, but its terror or territory. And they compel us to ask, what kind of visibility are we offering? What kind of voices are we willing to hear? And what kind of stories will we make room for, especially when they refuse to conform? This, for me, is the task of a truly transformative cultural practice. It's not to rescue Arab American women from silence, but to recognize the brilliance with which they speak, even in and especially through the constraints imposed upon them. Thank you.